Welcome back to Silent Screams, where we bring you terrifying stories that creep under your skin and stay with you long after the lights go out. Tonight, we're heading into the wilderness, where campfires do little to keep the darkness at bay. These are true tales of terror, where seemingly peaceful hikes and camping trips turn into nightmares. So if you're brave enough, join me as we venture into the woods. But be warned, some things were never meant to be found. I've always been someone who loved the outdoors. The solitude, the peace, the feeling of being miles away from civilization, it was like therapy for me. That's why when my friend suggested we do a camping and hiking trip deep in the woods for a few days, I jumped at the chance. Little did I know, this trip would change the way I looked at nature forever. There were 4 of us, me, Kyle, Sarah, and my best friend Matt. We'd all been friends since high school, and even though life had taken us in different directions, we made it a point to get together at least once a year for something adventurous. This year, we decided on a remote camping spot in a national park that none of us had ever been to. It wasn't on any tourist maps, which meant it was perfect, isolated, untouched, and far from the noise of the world. The hike out to the site was beautiful. The trees stretched tall and ancient above us, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. The sun filtered through the branches, casting dappled shadows on the trail. We laughed and joked as we walked, oblivious to the dangers that lurked just beyond the tree line. The hike took about 5 hours, and by the time we arrived at the clearing where we'd set up camp, we were exhausted but excited. "Man, this is perfect," Kyle said, dropping his pack and stretching his arms. "I can't believe there's no one else out here." "That's the point," Sarah replied, grinning. No noise, no people, just us and nature. Matt was already setting up his tent. "I say we get everything set up before dark. It's supposed to get chilly tonight." We all agreed, and soon enough, our tents were up, the fire pit was ready, and we were sitting around a campfire, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon. The woods were quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was peaceful for a while. As night fell, the forest seemed to change. The once calming silence became oppressive, almost too quiet, like the woods were holding their breath. I noticed it first, but didn't say anything. I didn't want to sound paranoid. But soon enough, Sarah broke the silence. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice low, almost hesitant. "Hear what?" Matt said, poking at the fire. "That," she said, her eyes scanning the darkness. "It's like, I don't know, something moving. Up there." We all listened, but I didn't hear anything at first. Then Kyle spoke up. "Probably just an animal," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "We're in the woods. What did you expect?" But the more I listened, the more I could hear it too. It wasn't the typical sounds of a forest at night. No crickets, no owls, just something. A faint rustling, like footsteps, circling the campsite. "Maybe we should check it out," I suggested, though my stomach twisted at the thought of venturing into the darkness. "Nah, let's not go looking for trouble," Matt said, though he was already standing. He grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. "I'll just take a quick look." The beam of light cut through the darkness, but revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Trees, bushes, shadows. Everything seemed still. "See," Kyle said, trying to laugh it off. "Nothing." But as soon as Matt turned off the flashlight, we heard it again. This time louder. Closer. It was unmistakable now. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching leaves underfoot. "What the hell is that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. We all stood up, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing. Just darkness pressing in from all sides. "I think we should get inside the tents," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe it's just a deer or something, but let's not take any chances." No one argued. We all grabbed our stuff and retreated to our tents, zipping them up tight. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest as I lay there, staring up at the nylon ceiling, listening. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence that replaced them was even worse. It was too quiet, too still, like the woods themselves were watching us. I must have fallen asleep at some point, but I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with each passing second, a whisper. Faint, unintelligible, but definitely a whisper. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the tent. My first thought was that it was Matt or Kyle messing with me, but as I listened, the whispering grew more distinct, more urgent. It wasn't in any language I recognized, but there was a strange cadence to it, almost like chanting. I sat up slowly, my heart racing. "Matt," I whispered, but there was no response. "Kyle." Nothing. The whispering continued, circling around me, as if it were coming from all directions at once. I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking, and flicked it on. The beam of light illuminated the inside of the tent, but there was no one there. I was alone. And then the zipper of the tent started to move, slowly, deliberately, as if someone or something was on the other side trying to get in. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of the zipper. The whispering stopped. The zipper paused. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, in one swift motion, the zipper yanked all the way down. I gasped, scrambling backward as the tent flap fell open. But there was no one there. Just darkness. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I saw something. A figure standing just outside the tent, tall and pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. It was only there for a moment, but that was enough. I dropped the flashlight, my hand shaking uncontrollably, and grabbed the zipper, pulling it closed as fast as I could. I sat there, trembling, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. It couldn't have been real. It had to be a trick of the light, or maybe I was still half asleep. But deep down, I knew. It was real. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and adrenaline. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every rustle, every creak of the forest made my heart race. I kept the flashlight on, clutching it like a lifeline, waiting for the morning light to save me from whatever was out there. When the sun finally rose, I stumbled out of the tent, exhausted and shaken. Kyle, Sarah, and Matt were already awake, sitting around a cold fire pit, their faces pale and drawn. I could tell by the look in their eyes that they had experienced something too. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice flat and emotionless. None of us argued. We packed up in silence, the oppressive feeling of the night still hanging over us. As we made our way back through the woods, the atmosphere felt different. The trees seemed darker, more twisted. The trail that had been so welcoming the day before now felt like it was leading us deeper into something we couldn't escape. Halfway through the hike back, Matt stopped suddenly. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his eyes wide. We all froze, listening. At first, there was nothing, just the wind in the trees. But then, faint and distant, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, echoing through the forest. "Run," Kyle whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. We ran, our feet pounding the dirt trail as the footsteps grew louder, closer. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could think about was getting out, escaping whatever was following us. By the time we reached the parking lot, we were gasping for breath, our clothes soaked with sweat. The footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of being watched hadn't. We piled into the car, slamming the doors shut, and sped away from the forest as fast as we could. No one said a word. We didn't need to. We all knew that something had followed us out of those woods. Something that wasn't finished with us yet. I haven't been back to the woods since that trip. I can't. Every time I think about going camping or hiking, I hear those footsteps, feel those hollow eyes watching me from the darkness. The others, we don't talk about it. Not directly, anyway. But sometimes late at night, I'll get a text from Matt or Sarah. Just a few words. "Did you hear it again?" Because the thing is, we never really left those woods. Not entirely. It's still out there watching, waiting. And every now and then, when the night is quiet and the world is still, can hear it. Footsteps. Coming closer. I didn't talk about what happened for months. Every time I tried to, I'd hear those footsteps in my head, and my throat would close up. It was as if the fear had followed me out of the forest and settled into my bones, lurking there, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Matt, Kyle, and Sarah felt it too. We all agreed, without ever really saying it out loud, to pretend it never happened. But pretending something didn't happen doesn't make it go away. A few months after the trip, I started noticing strange things. It began with small, seemingly insignificant moments. A glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, the feeling that someone or something was standing just behind me. At first, I thought I was just paranoid. That maybe the fear of that night had messed with my mind, made me jumpy. But then it got worse. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. Not the usual creaks and groans of the house settling, but slow, deliberate steps, moving up and down the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, frozen in place, listening. I wanted to believe it was nothing. Maybe one of my neighbors or just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. It was the same sound from that night in the woods, the same heavy, measured footsteps. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I found muddy footprints just outside my front door. They were small, human-sized, but something was off. The prints were too shallow, as if whoever or whatever made them had barely touched the ground. I should have been scared, but more than anything, I was tired. Tired of living with a constant dread, the gnawing feeling that I wasn't alone. I had to know if the others were experiencing the same thing. I called Matt first. "Hey man, you've been hearing anything weird lately?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice low and tense. "You've been hearing it too?" That was all I needed to hear. "Yeah, the footsteps. It's been happening for weeks now." "Same here," he said, barely above a whisper. "And it's not just me. Sarah called me a few days ago. She said she's been seeing things, figures, shadows moving around her house. A cold chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just me. Whatever had followed us out of the woods hadn't forgotten about us." We met up at a coffee shop the next day. Kyle joined us too, looking pale and drawn. He sat down without saying a word, just nodding in acknowledgement. The three of us exchanged uneasy glances, knowing we were all thinking the same thing. "I don't know what it is," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "But it's getting worse. It's not just footsteps anymore. Last night, I woke up and I saw it. Standing at the foot of my bed. My stomach turned. What do you mean?" She swallowed hard, her hand shaking slightly as she took a sip of coffee. I don't know what else to call it. It was tall, pale, with hollow eyes, just like what we saw in the woods. But it didn't do anything. It just watched me. I felt like I was going to be sick. This wasn't just some creepy coincidence. We had all seen the same thing, and it was following us, invading our lives in ways we couldn't explain. The more we talked, the clearer it became. We were all haunted by something none of us could understand. "I've been doing some research," Kyle said, breaking the silence. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure, but there's something out there. Some kind of legend tied to the area where we camped. I leaned in, my heart racing. What kind of legend? He pulled out his phone and showed us a few articles he had saved. "It's called The Watcher." "The Watcher?" Sarah repeated, her voice trembling. "What does that mean?" "It's an old story, something the locals used to talk about, but no one really believed. There's this legend about a spirit or a creature that lives in the woods. It watches people, follows them, sometimes even takes them. But it doesn't just attack. It waits until you're vulnerable, until you invite it in." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "Invite it in? What are you talking about?" Kyle hesitated, his eyes dark. "Remember the whispering we heard that night? And how we all felt like something was watching us, even after we left?" We all nodded. I could still hear those whispers, echoing in my mind. That's how it starts, Kyle continued. The Watcher makes itself known, subtly at first. It gets into your head, makes you paranoid. Then, over time, it becomes more visible. The more you acknowledge it, the stronger it gets. It feeds off your fear, your attention. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it all. So what? We're being haunted because we camped in the wrong place. It's not just that, Kyle said. It's because we listened. We heard the whispers. We acknowledged it. That's how we let it in. There was a long, heavy silence as his words sank in. If what he was saying was true, then we were dealing with something far more dangerous than just a bad memory. This thing wasn't going to stop until it had us. So what do we do? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. We have to face it, Matt said, surprising us all. He had been quiet for most of the conversation, but now there was a determination in his eyes. We go back to the woods. We confront it. That's insane, I said. You want to go back to where this all started? Matt nodded. I don't think we have a choice. If we don't stop it now, it'll keep coming after us. It'll never leave us alone. Sarah looked like she was about to cry. But what if we don't make it back? We will, Matt said, though his voice wavered slightly. We have to. A week later, we were standing at the edge of the forest again, backpacks slung over our shoulders, flashlights in hand. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees, and the air was thick with the same oppressive silence I remembered from our last trip. I didn't want to be there. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to turn around and run. But I knew that if we didn't end this now, it would never stop. The Watcher would follow us, haunt us until there was nothing left. Are we really doing this? Sarah whispered, glancing nervously at the darkening woods. We have to, Matt said, his jaw clenched. Stay close. Don't get separated. We walked in silence, the sounds of the forest growing fainter with each step. The deeper we went, the heavier the air became. It was as if the trees themselves were watching us, leaning in closer, blocking out the light. After what felt like hours, we reached the spot where we had camped. The clearing looked the same, but there was an unnatural stillness to it, as if time had frozen the moment we left. I could feel it, the Watcher. It was here waiting for us. What now? Kyle asked, his voice barely audible. We call it, Matt said, stepping forward. We make it show itself. I didn't know how he planned to do that, but before I could ask, the whispers started again. Low, faint, but unmistakable. They seemed to come from all around us, echoing through the trees. Do you hear it? Matt asked, his eyes scanning the darkness. We all nodded, fear gripping us like a vice. Don't run, Matt warned. That's what it wants. We stay together. Suddenly, the whispering grew louder, more urgent. The air grew colder, and the trees around us seemed to bend and twist, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Then I saw it. Standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of our flashlights, was the Watcher. Tall and thin, its pale skin stretched tight over its bones, its hollow eyes locked onto us. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just watched. What do we do? Sarah whimpered, clutching my arm. Matt stepped forward, his flashlight trained on the Watcher. We end this, he said, his voice trembling but resolute. The Watcher tilted its head, as if curious, and then it began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it took a step toward us. We can't just stand here, Kyle shouted. We have to do something. Stay calm, Matt said, though his voice was shaking. It feeds on fear. But it was too late. I could feel the terror rising in me, uncontrollable, suffocating. The Watcher took another step, and then another, its movement slow but inevitable. Suddenly, the whispers grew deafening, filling my head with incoherent words, drowning out everything else. I dropped to my knees, clutching my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was coming from inside my mind. Stop, I screamed, but the whispers only grew louder. And then, just as quickly as it began, everything went silent. I opened my eyes and looked up. The Watcher was gone. Matt stood over me, breathing heavily, his flashlight flickering. Is it over? I don't know, I whispered, my voice barely audible. We waited, but the forest remained still. No footsteps, no whispers, just silence. Maybe we did it, Sarah said, her voice trembling with hope. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we had faced the Watcher and won. But deep down, I knew better. As we made our way back through the woods, the oppressive feeling slowly lifted, but something still lingered in the back of my mind. The Watcher was gone for now. But it wasn't defeated. It was waiting. And someday, when we least expect it, it will come back.